"You've never given me anything worth being proud of, Dad," my daughter said. She didn't whisper it. She didn't lean across the table and say it quietly so only I could hear. She said it loud enough for her mother-in-law to set down her wine glass, loud enough for her husband to stop chewing, loud enough for my 7-year-old granddaughter to look up from her plate with that confused expression kids get when the adults in the room suddenly stop being adults. I didn't say a word. Not because I couldn't think of anything to say. I had about 15 years of things to say. I just chose not to say any of them, because I knew something that nobody else at that table knew, and I had known it for exactly 6 hours. That morning, I had signed the paperwork that transferred 43% ownership of a logistics company. I'd spent 11 years building from a single leased truck and a folding table in my garage into something that a private equity firm in Atlanta had decided was worth more money than I would have believed possible when I was eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch to keep the business alive. I held my fork, I looked at my daughter, I thought about the morning, then I cut another piece of pork roast and put it in my mouth. My name is Walt, not Walter, not the formal version, just Walt. I've been just Walt my whole life. I grew up in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the kind of town where people knew your father and had opinions about him before they had opinions about you. My father drove a delivery truck for 32 years. Same route, same truck, different seasons. He was the most reliable man I ever knew and the most invisible. People treated him the way people treat furniture, grateful it's there, never thinking about what it took to make it. I swore I was going to be different. I didn't know what different meant when I was 22 and marrying Cheryl and working at a freight company loading pallets at 5 in the morning. I just knew I wanted more. Not more money necessarily, more of something. I couldn't have named it then. Cheryl and I had our daughter, Megan, in 1994. She came into the world loud and certain about everything, and she stayed that way. She was the kind of child who corrected her teachers and was usually right, who had opinions about which route to take to the grocery store and could explain why her route was better. I loved that about her. I bragged about it to anyone who would listen. My daughter, the debater. My daughter, the one who's going to run something someday. What I didn't understand was that somewhere along the way, Megan stopped directing that certainty outward and started aiming some of it at me. It happened gradually. These things always do. You don't notice a thermostat changing degree by degree. You just notice one day that the room is cold. When she was in high school, it was small things. An eye roll when I talked about work. A certain flatness in her voice when she introduced me to her friends. I told myself it was teenage stuff. All kids go through it. She'd grow out of it. She went to college at Vanderbilt on a partial scholarship and loans she took out herself, which I respected. I was proud of that. I helped where I could, 200 here, 300 there, whatever I could scrape together. I was in the middle of trying to get my own thing off the ground by then. I'd left the freight company in 2003 to start a small logistics and transportation consulting operation. Just me, a used pickup, a laptop, and a client list I was building from cold calls. Cheryl and I divorced in 2006. It was civil as divorces go. We'd grown in different directions, which is a polite way of saying we had become different people who no longer particularly liked each other. Megan was 12. She stayed with Cheryl during the week, with me on weekends when I wasn't on the road trying to keep my business breathing. I missed a lot of things I shouldn't have missed. I know that. A school play in October 2007, I had a client meeting in Nashville that ran 3 hours over. Her junior prom, I was in Memphis. I told myself I was building something for her future, which was partly true, and partly the thing fathers tell themselves when they choose work over presents and need to sleep at night. By the time Megan graduated college, the business had grown. Slowly, painfully, 2 steps forward and 1 step sideways. I had 4 drivers, a small warehouse I leased in Smyrna, and contracts with 3 regional manufacturers. Nothing impressive. But it was mine, and it worked, and I was proud of it in the quiet way you're proud of something nobody else can see the difficulty of. Megan graduated with a business degree, got a job at a marketing firm in Charlotte, and met a man named Griffin. Griffin's family had money. Old money, the kind that doesn't announce itself but surrounds everything it touches like a scent. His father had built a commercial real estate development company that Griffin had walked into after his MBA. His mother served on 3 nonprofit boards. Their home in Charlotte's Myers Park neighborhood had a circular driveway and a guest house that was nicer than any apartment I'd ever rented. I'm not saying money is bad. I'm not saying Griffin was bad. I actually liked Griffin for the first couple of years. He was polite. He was smart. He made Megan happy in a way that I could see even when I was visiting and feeling like a man who'd shown up to a black tie event in work clothes. What I noticed, and told myself I was imagining was that around Griffin's family, Megan became someone slightly different, more careful, more conscious of certain words and references. She stopped talking about how I'd started the business. She stopped mentioning Murfreesboro. When Griffin's mother asked what I did for a living at their first family dinner, Megan said, before I could answer, "He runs a small trucking operation." Not wrong exactly, just smaller than the truth. Cheryl remarried in 2011, a man named Charles who was a financial advisor and had a calm, confident way of filling a room. He was good to Megan. He helped her with tax questions and investment accounts and the kind of practical knowledge I'd learned by making expensive mistakes while he'd apparently been born understanding. Megan started calling him Chuck with an ease that I recognized but couldn't name at the time. The wedding was in 2015. Griffin and Megan got married at a vineyard outside Asheville, beautiful and expensive, and I gave what I could for the rehearsal dinner. A contribution that was dwarfed quietly and without comment by Griffin's parents. I danced with my daughter to a song she'd loved when she was little, and I thought, standing there in the middle of that vineyard with string lights above us and strangers around us, that maybe this was enough. That maybe presence was enough. That I had been there. After the wedding, things shifted again, another degree. Megan now looked at me sometimes the way you look at a thing you've outgrown and can't figure out where to put. I kept building. In 2017, I brought on a partner, a woman named Faye who'd spent 15 years in regional freight management and understood the operational side in ways I didn't. We restructured, invested in fleet management software, started going after mid-size e-commerce contracts. It was the kind of unglamorous, grinding work that nobody writes articles about but that compounds over time the way good habits do. My granddaughter was born in 2018. Lily, though I should say they named her something else, I'll call her something else here. I'll call her the best thing. The absolute best thing. She came into the world, and I drove to Charlotte the weekend after she was born, and held her for 3 hours while Megan slept, and Griffin made phone calls, and I thought, this is what all of it is for. I drove back to Tennessee with the kind of full-chest feeling that doesn't need explaining. But even then, even with the granddaughter and the Sunday calls and the holiday visits, there was a distance in Megan that I kept bumping up against. She would ask about the business in a tone that suggested she'd already decided. The answer was nothing interesting. When I tried to explain what we were building, the contracts, the expansion into last-mile delivery for 2 retailers in the Southeast, her eyes would do the thing eyes do when someone is waiting for you to finish talking. Griffin's parents came to every birthday party. They flew in from Charlotte. They bought the kind of gifts that came in boxes with ribbons that required scissors. I drove up in my 2009 F-150 with the cracked dashboard and a gift card and a card I'd spent 40 minutes picking out at the Walgreens off the highway. I was not oblivious. I knew what I looked like from the outside. What nobody at that table in Charlotte knew was what was happening inside the business. In 2019, a national logistics firm had approached Faye about an acquisition conversation. We hadn't been ready. I'd said no, and I meant it. We weren't at a place where selling made sense, but the conversation had happened, and that meant someone outside my world had placed a number on what we'd built, and the number had surprised me. In 2021, a private equity group out of Atlanta started showing up in the industry conversations I was having at conferences. They were buying regional carriers and consolidating. I knew 2 owners who'd sold to them. Both had been paid well and moved on. I filed the information in the back of my mind and kept working. By 2023, the business had grown to 31 drivers, 2 warehouse facilities, and contracts with 7 corporate clients, including a regional grocery chain, and 2 e-commerce companies that had expanded their southeastern footprints during the pandemic and needed ground-level logistics infrastructure that the big national carriers couldn't provide cost-effectively at their scale. The PE firm called Faye in January. Faye told me the same day. We spent 4 months in negotiations I told nobody about, not even Cheryl, not even my brother in Knoxville. I worked with a transaction attorney. I did the kind of due diligence that felt like performing surgery on something I'd built with my own hands. In early November, we agreed on a number, 43% of the company, for an amount that, when the attorney laid it out in plain language in his office in Nashville, made me sit very still for a long time. I signed the papers on a Thursday morning. That Thursday evening, Griffin's mother had organized a family dinner at their house in Charlotte. It was her birthday, 70 years old, a celebration she'd been planning since summer. I had driven up that afternoon, 6 hours in the truck, the same truck, the cracked dashboard, and the cup holder that only worked on one side. I arrived at a table set for 12. Griffin's extended family, his aunt and uncle from Raleigh, his sister who'd flown in from Denver, his parents' friends who'd known Griffin since he was in diapers, and me. I sat across from Megan, next to a man I'd met twice whose name I'd already forgotten. The wine was poured. The food was served. I was aware, the way you become aware of a temperature difference when you walk from one room into another, that I didn't quite fit, that the references being made, ski trips, a club that required membership, renovations on a lake house, were not my references. I ate the food. I complimented the hostess. I talked about the drive up, about the weather, about my granddaughter's latest kindergarten production of something involving butterflies and a cardboard forest. And then Griffin's mother, lovely woman, I want to be clear, a genuinely lovely woman who did not intend what happened, asked the table a question about what everyone was working on, a conversation starter. The kind thing hosts do to fill the space. Griffin talked about a commercial development project in South Carolina. His father mentioned a property in Savannah. His sister said something about her consulting work. The man next to me named 3 organizations he sat on the board of, and then his mother turned to me, with the warm smile she always had, and said, "Walt, how are things with your business?" I started to answer. I said something about good growth, strong client relationships, the Southeast market being particularly active, the kind of honest, real answer I might give to anyone. My daughter looked at her plate, and then she said it. "It's fine, Mom." Griffin's mom, I mean. A small laugh, a tiny adjustment, and then, "You've never given me anything worth being proud of, Dad. It's just trucks. Just trucks." The table went quiet in the particular way. Tables go quiet when someone has said a thing that can't be unsaid. I heard the hostess set her wine glass down. I heard the uncle from Raleigh clear his throat. My granddaughter looked up from the butterfly drawing she'd been working on in the corner chair and said, "Daddy, what did Mommy say?" And I sat there with my fork in my hand and my chest doing something complicated and quiet. And I thought about the papers I'd signed that morning in a lawyer's office in Nashville. And I thought about my father driving the same route for 32 years. And I thought about the peanut butter sandwiches and the 5 a.m. shifts and the client call I'd taken from a hospital waiting room when my mother was having her gallbladder out, and the lease I'd signed on that first warehouse with hands that were shaking enough that the pen slid. I put down my fork. I looked at my daughter. I said, "You're right that I haven't always been easy to be proud of." And I picked my fork back up and I finished my dinner, because there was nothing else to say. Not yet, not there, not with Griffin's family watching and my granddaughter 3 feet away. The drive home was 6 hours. I turned the radio off somewhere around Cookeville and just drove. The highway at night, the white lines, the dark shapes of trees. I thought about whether I was angry. I don't think I was, exactly. Anger requires surprise, and I hadn't been surprised. What I felt was something closer to tired, not exhausted. Just the specific weight of a thing you've been carrying for years without naming it. I called my brother the next morning. He picked up on the second ring, which is what he always does. "How was the drive?" I told him what Megan had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You going to tell her?" I told him I didn't know. I said I needed to think about it. "Walt," he said, "you spent 20 years building that thing. She doesn't know what it is." I said I knew. He said, "Don't just let her keep not knowing." I didn't call Megan the next day or the day after. I went back to work. Faye and I had transition meetings with the PE firm. There were legal and operational things to handle, a process that consumed the following 2 weeks in the way large processes do. I was busy in the good way, the way where the hours move with purpose and the evening comes before you expected it. Megan called me the following Saturday. It was a routine call, the kind we'd developed over the years. Weather, granddaughter updates, a few minutes of surface conversation. She didn't mention dinner. I didn't either. She asked how the business was going. I said, "We finalized a deal last month." She said, "Oh?" I told her, not all of it at once. I told her that Faye and I had closed a partial acquisition with a private equity group, that the deal had valued the business at a number. I then said out loud. There was a pause on the line, a real pause, the kind that means someone is recalculating. "Dad," she said. It's a good outcome," I said. 11 years, good timing, good market." Another pause. I didn't know," she said. "I know, I didn't know it was that. I know, Megan." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm really sorry about what I said at dinner." I let that sit for a few seconds. Not to be cruel. Just because it deserved more than a quick, "It's fine. I heard you," I said. "I know you meant it." She started to say something and stopped. I said, "I'm not looking for an apology about the money. That's not what I want you to understand." "Then what?" I thought about my father. The delivery truck, 32 years of the same route, and the way people looked through him. I thought about the first time I closed a contract I was genuinely proud of, and called my mother to tell her, and heard in her voice the kind of proud that doesn't need proof. I want you to understand that the truck thing, the business, the 20 years, those weren't failures, I said. That was real work, real skill. I built something real, and I want you to know that before anything else, before the money. I want you to know what actually happened. She was crying by then, quietly, the way adults cry when they're embarrassed and sad at the same time. I didn't tell her everything was fine, because it wasn't entirely fine, and I wasn't going to lie to her about that. But I also didn't hold on to the anger, because I realized I didn't actually have much. What I had was sadness, a specific old sadness about the distance between who my daughter thought I was and who I'd actually been working to become. What happened over the following months was gradual. Megan called more often. Real calls, not surface calls. She asked actual questions about the business, about how we'd grown it, about what it had taken. She asked me once about a specific contract I'd described, and I realized she was asking because she genuinely wanted to understand, not because she was performing interest. Griffin called me one afternoon unexpectedly and asked if I'd be willing to talk to him about logistics for a project he was working on. He wanted my actual opinion, professional advice. He said, "You understand this space better than anyone I've talked to." I said I'd be glad to. My granddaughter had a school project at the end of the year, 2nd grade, something about community helpers and the people who made things work. She asked me what I did for a job. I told her that I helped move things from one place to another, so that when people ordered something and needed it, it got there. I told her that's what trucks do, that a lot of life depends on trucks and the people who manage them. She said, "So you're kind of like a helper?" I said, "Yeah, kind of exactly like that." She colored a picture for her project. She drew a truck, brown crayon, slightly crooked wheels, and she put my name under it, Grandpa Walt. She added what I can only describe as a very enthusiastic son in the upper right corner. She brought it home and told her mother she wanted to frame it. Megan texted me a photo of the drawing the same day. No message, just the photo. I looked at it for a long time. A brown truck with crooked wheels and a big sun, and my name in 2nd grade letters underneath. I thought about how much I had wanted, for how many years, for someone in my family to just see the thing clearly. Not the size of it, not the money, not what it looked like compared to someone else's thing. Just the fact of it, the realness of it, the 20 years of choosing it and fighting for it and learning it and refusing to quit. My daughter hadn't given me that, not for a long time, but my granddaughter with a brown crayon and a crooked truck had given me something I didn't know I was still waiting for. I framed the drawing myself. I put it in a simple black frame from the hardware store and hung it in my office, right next to the copy of the first contract I ever signed that was worth more than $10,000. People who come into my office sometimes ask about it. The drawing, the crooked truck. I tell them my granddaughter made it. They say, "That's sweet." I say, "Yeah, it really is." What I don't usually say is what I actually think when I look at it, which is that the whole story of my life is in that drawing. A man who moved things from one place to another, who was invisible to the people whose opinion he wanted most, for longer than he should have allowed. Who built something real and quiet and unglamorous, while everyone around him was looking in a different direction. And who, at 61 years old, standing in a lawyer's office in Nashville on a Thursday morning with a pen in his hand, finally had the number to prove it, and who discovered a few months later that the number was not actually the thing he'd needed proved. The drawing was. I failed at marriage. I failed at being present for too many of the moments that mattered. I failed at making my daughter feel for too many years that what I was doing was worth her attention. But I built something real, with real work, real decisions, real risk, real mornings at 5 a.m., in a leased warehouse in Smyrna, Tennessee, when there were 3 clients on the books, and I genuinely didn't know if there would be 4. That was real. And I finally stopped needing anyone else to tell me so.